Good evening, everybody. I'm Michael Tabman, and welcome to Crimes and Times. So who out there does not like to speak about serial killers? And that's what we're going to talk about tonight. We have a fantastic show with two really outstanding guests. We have joining us today Nadia Fazani, a journalist and an author who has interviewed and spoken with serial killers. And we're going to hear about her experience. And we have an old colleague of mine, Jim Clemente, a former FBI profiler, who now lends his expertise to Hollywood. He has a lot of experience to share with us. We're going to start tonight with Jim because we want to go back a couple of shows, get a little bit off topic for a moment. A couple of shows ago, you may have remembered, we spoke about Amanda Knox. We had on an author who believes that Amanda Knox was guilty. Jim, I think you have a little different take on that. When we spoke a few weeks ago, the author gave us fairly broad evidence, motive, opportunity, and just some opinions as to why she felt that Amanda was guilty. She talked about the lack of DNA evidence, meaning that some of the evidence that should be left behind by Amanda, by nature of living there, wasn't there. What's your take on the Amanda Knox case?
Well, Michael, I have to say that you were very, very kind to Lisa and her co-author Nick. You kept asking her for evidence as opposed to opinion, and she kept saying, "I think, I believe, we feel." Those kinds of things. And I'm sorry, feelings have nothing to do with a criminal case. This was a murder, a brutal rape and murder, no matter what Lisa says. Meredith Kercher was raped and murdered, not necessarily in that order, but she was raped and murdered. And the fact is that it was a brutal crime that was committed by one person. Unfortunately, the forensic experts that they used in that case did not collect the evidence properly. They contaminated almost all the evidence that they did collect. I mean, there were videos that they took while they were collecting it, kicking things around on the floor, using the same dirty gloves, going from one room to another room, walking in the same booties, evidence booties, from one room to another room, over blood samples, tracking them into other rooms and so forth. So there was absolutely no evidence that tied Amanda Knox or Raphael Solecito to the murder. However, yes, they were tied to the location because Amanda lived there and Raphael had visited there, and he was certainly there that morning. And for example, the clasp that she talked about, there was actually 7 different types of male DNA on that clasp. You could see when they collected it, first of all, that they originally had kicked it under a rug and stuffed it in another area. But then when they came back 42 days later, they actually picked it up with gloves. You can see the dirt on the gloves. They held it by that clasp that they had just used those same gloves to open the same door that Raphael had tried to open. And they picked up a bunch of things, and they clearly contaminated it right there on video. So it's just ridiculous. But she kept saying that Amanda was a drug user, like a heavily, involved in drugs. She smoked pot, something that's legal in this state where I live now. It says she had all these sexual partners. Well, actually, she was a young person. She didn't have an exclusive relationship, but she did mess around with a bunch of guys. But that is kind of victim blaming. I mean, we don't say that to guys. We don't call them a whore. We don't say they're a murderer just because they have sexual partners. She clearly had an issue with the facts, the truth. She said that, of course, people in Italy were all up in arms because Amanda Knox came from America and killed one of their own. Does she not know that Meredith Kercher was actually from the UK? I mean, come on. Get your facts right. If you're going to write a book, research it. Find out what the facts are. She read some things. She made some outrageous claims. It's really not true. For example, she said this body was displayed in a sexual way. And then 2 seconds later, she said, and it was covered up with a blanket. Well, covering something up and displaying are two very contradictory things. As a matter of fact, she had a fatal wound. While she was dying, she was sexually assaulted and raped, and she was moved around during the course of that. There's no evidence that she was moved around after death. There was no evidence that the bra was cut off after death. I mean, there's so many things that she got absolutely factually wrong, including the fact that Amanda was not tried twice. She was tried multiple times. And the reason why, in the end, she was acquitted was, as they found out, as the Court of Cassation found out, there was absolutely no evidence ever tying her to the crime. It was all emotion. It was all built by Rudy Guede. It was all done by Rudy Guede. However, McNeely, when he tried Rudy Gede, immediately after that, he had that verdict certified. And during the course of that trial, he brought in evidence against Amanda and Raffaele without them being represented. So it was uncontroverted evidence. It was just brought in, never actually cross-examined, never actually scrutinized. And then he had that certified. So the Supreme Court of Italy could never go against that certified verdict. Once they have certified a verdict, they can't go against it. So they had to contort things in the end to say, well, Raffaele and Amanda were not guilty. However, 2 other people did help Rudy Gede. It was just a farce. The whole thing was a farce. That's all I have to say about it.
Well, you can see now why it would be very exciting to have you on during that show. But one last question for you on that case, Jim.
Sure.
I read the High Court's decision, which was a complete and total beatdown of the Italian police. And could you imagine if you and I had that happen to us as FBI agents? Where would that career have been? Where would that career have been after that?
But let me just tell you, it wasn't just the Italian police. It was the prosecutor. If you want to know what this guy's capable of, read the book Monster of Florence, because he did exactly the same thing in that case, which preceded the Meredith Kercher murder. And he was indicted and convicted of a felony for misuse of office for what he did in that crime. That's exactly what he did in to Amanda Knox. However, when the Amanda Knox thing was going on, they quietly vacated that conviction and sent it down to the lower courts. And they decided, well, we'll do nothing about it. We'll promote him so he can't try any more cases. But they let it go. And he's a criminal, and he should have been the one locked up.
Right.
My opinion.
Yeah, no, you make a good point. And I think on another show, when I talk about wrongful convictions, when we talk about the irresponsibility sometimes not just of law enforcement, but of the prosecution as well. Because you get misconduct on those 2, it's almost impossible to avoid a wrongful conviction. Thanks for those very excellent points. Nadia, so you've spoken to serial killers. Tell us about that. What made you want to do that? What did you learn? And tell us the insight you've gotten about these personalities.
Well, at first, I didn't understand how someone could just turn to be a serial killer. Like, how can someone just go on the street and kill a pure stranger, someone who has never done anything to that person? So I was covering sports, then I was covering personalities, and then I needed to change something a little more challenging, so I decided to interview one serial killer. But then I got magazines and newspapers asking me for more and more interviews, so it ended up being 19 interviews with serial killers.
So who was the first one? Who was the first one that you interviewed?
The first one was Arthur Shawcross, who was also a cannibal. Mm-hmm. And he went to prison because he killed 2 children, got out of prison, and then killed 11 prostitutes. When I asked him for an interview, he said